The meeting is reconvened and I welcome Nicola Richards, Director of People in the Scottish Government. Can I begin, please, by inviting Ms Richards to take the solemn affirmation? If you would raise your right hand, please, and then repeat after me. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm.
I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
that I will tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. I now invite Ms Richards to make a very brief opening statement to explain her role in the Scottish Government and the development of the complaints procedure.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, members. Convener, these opening words aim to give context about my role and responsibilities as Director of People, specifically with regard to the development of the harassment procedure. I have been in the Scottish Government's People Directorate since late 2010, initially on the learning and organisational development side, and have led the overall directorate since May 2016. The directorate has around 250 staff, covering a wide range of responsibilities and technical expertise, so my role is one of strategic direction and management oversight. The Scottish Government is a fair work employer, and this is reflected in our approach to equality, mental health and well-being. We have a public sector duty under the Equality Act to eliminate unlawful discrimination, which includes sexual harassment. Bullying harassment is not and never has been acceptable in the workplace. As the Permanent Secretary set out in earlier evidence, the Me Too movement in 2017 added momentum to a range of work which was already underway through our People Plan to tackle bullying and harassment and promote an inclusive workplace. During this period, what Cabinet described as a watershed moment, my role involved coordinating various strands of work, from staff communications to accelerating internal policy reviews and ensuring that the Permanent Secretary was regularly briefed across the full range of activity. In relation to the review commissioned by Cabinet and the development of the ministerial harassment procedure, I worked in close partnership with Cabinet Secretariat, legal and HR professional colleagues on its development to ensure the Commission was fulfilled. Finally, as was set out last week, I am giving evidence to the committee on behalf of ministers and not in a personal capacity. This is complex legal territory, so I ask the committee's forbearance if I have to seek advice or follow up in writing with detail to ensure accuracy and that all the government's legal duties are fulfilled. And finally, given that they have been invited to engage with this inquiry, I would also wish to declare that I'm a member of the union FDA. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Ms Richards, and I'll now ask committee members to give their questions to you. Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Richards, you've indicated that you took your present role in May 2006, but you were in the Director previous to that. So can you confirm that that previous experience helped you to understand how the Fairness to Work policy was working in practice and any potential gaps?
Thank you. Just to clarify, my role in People Directorate between 2010 and 2014 was largely on the learning and development side, so I would have had less involvement at that point with the Fairness at Work policy. Around August 2014, I expanded my role and that then took on some more of the HR policy side, but not the direct bullying and harassment investigation side of things, so less in that area. I think on Fairness at Work more generally, it serves us reasonably well, I think, as an overall policy. It is reasonably unremarkable in that way. The provision relating to ministers that exists within Fairness at Work and has been in Fairness at Work since 2010, I think by early 2017, there was starting to be a sense that we should look at that again, partly because it doesn't lock in as clearly as it could do with the ministerial code, and that was one of the issues that we sought to resolve through the new procedure. And I think if we work ahead, we do have a commitment to review our wider policies, including Fairness at Work, and I think over time we would probably move towards a more kind of standalone set of policies and procedures rather than just having one overall setting in that way. But, you know, these things are always open to continued development.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I ask, given your role as Head of HR of the complaints, did you have involvement in the partnership agreement and with talks or informal discussions with the Council of Government Unions? And if so, can you say what issues regarding complaints, either informal or formal, about bullying or sexual harassment were raised with you between you taking post in May 2016 and until about August 2017?
Sorry, just to clarify, does that mean all bullying and harassment for,
Yeah.
across
Yeah,
for civil
for-
servants, or just for
well,
ministers?
Involving current foreign ministers and any other general issues that you would like to flag up as being of concern that was raised.
Okay, and obviously you'll understand that it's probably not appropriate for me to go into the detail of individual
just generally.
cases,
Yeah.
understandably. We have had, under the ministerial process, we have handled 2 issues under the Fairness at Work process involving ministers, involving current ministers. One of those was resolved at the informal stage, and that occurred at the early part of 2017. And there is another complaint that is still in progress, so I won't go into further detail about that one, but it is still at the informal stage.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I finally ask just about the people plans? Is this a UK survey? And is the survey that is put out in Scotland changed in any way, or are there standard questions, and were any new questions added in 2016?
Yeah, the People Survey is a UK civil service initiative, so it covers, I think, about 109 different organisations, all of the big UK departments, pretty much all of the agencies and bodies. So it's very much a core question set. Every year there's kind of a bidding process where you can try and get your local questions included within the wider question set. So at various points we've added questions that we felt were particularly relevant to initiatives that we had underway. For example, around monthly conversations, which is a kind of a well-being-led process that we try to have for our staff. So we included questions relating to monthly conversations. I think they would have come in ahead of 2016. I think probably the major change that has been made at a UK level to the survey that might be of interest to the committee in recent years was in 2019 was the first year that the survey had a breakdown of different sorts of harassment, because the bullying and harassment is quite a big catch-all, and there's a lot that gets covered within that. But in this year's survey it broke down, so sexual harassment is actually an individual item within that wider list. But my recollection was that that was a UK initiative rather than one that was specifically, I don't think we would have an opportunity to shape those particular kinds of questions.
Just to be clear, there was nothing added on the instigation of the Scottish Government to the 2016 survey, specifically about, former complaints and historic issues? Or any question added specifically to the 2016 survey at the request of the Scottish Government?
I would need to check what local questions we put forward that year, because each year we do put forward local questions. I think it would be very unusual for us to ask for questions as specific as that. It's a general survey, it's very widely responded to, we get a very good response rate, and it isn't for individuals. It's very clear that it's an anonymous survey. It isn't the route to raise issues. It's the route for you to identify concerns at a kind of broader cultural level. But it's not the route by which an individual would raise an individual issue. And it's always very important that staff understand that.
I'd be grateful if you could check back and confirm that. Thank you.
Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Ms Richards. We heard from James Hind earlier, who advised that you led all the work in relation to trade union agreement and engagement with regards to the policy development. Can you therefore explain why it would appear that trade union engagement appeared quite limited, given that there was only one formal meeting of the harassment working group?
I think as James set out, it's quite an unusual policy, this one. It's not, normally we would have a very extensive process with our trade unions when we were looking to bring in a policy that was going to be, if it was a full refit of fairness at work, it would be a very, very significant undertaking. This policy is slightly different because essentially the First Minister gets to decide. So the degree of union involvement is slightly different to how it would be normally. I think what was very clear from the exchanges with the unions from the earlier stages of this, that their absolute commitment was that the Scottish Government did not step away from having a policy related to complaints about ministers. That was their overriding concern, was that we stuck with the commitment that had been in place since 2010 in fairness at work. So my sense of all of the engagements that we'd had with the unions during that time was their concern was that we didn't water that down, that we didn't step back from that. They were perfectly content with there being kind of procedural changes, improvements to that, but I didn't perceive any particular difficulties there. The reassurance that we were seeking to give the unions through that time was that the Scottish Government was not looking to step away from having a process by which policies around ministers would be handled.
Okay, and obviously we'll hear more directly from the trade unions at a future session. But in the submissions received to committee from, I think it was a PCS, they expressed some commentary around that there was the stage 1 of the policy development, but then stage 2 just was paused and shelved. Can you explain why that was and whether work around stage 2 is proceeding or not?
Yes, I think it's a good question. This is part of stage 2, I think, is part of the answer. And stage 2 will also be the external review of the procedure that Laura Dunlop will take part in. I think because of the way in which circumstances have developed, it's been very difficult to finalise our work around fairness at work, to be able to take the ministerial aspect out of fairness at work and put that into a new standalone policy, because the procedure for that you're looking at today was under such a lot of scrutiny. It was very difficult, therefore, to do further work to that until all of these processes had completed. So there is still unfinished business there.
And the Permanent Secretary last week, in her opening remarks, said, we have already learned early lessons, and she was referring to procedural failures, from your experience, and that these lessons had been learned as part of the work being led by our People Directorate. So what have you learned?
A lot. Get another job, that kind of thing. It's been, a pretty exceptional period. I think I have learnt that whilst you can be fairly clear of all of the ground that you're standing on in terms of the advice and the legal position, that there are times when you may have to step very, very carefully in the way in which things are applied, if that is going to meet some of the very significant tests that might be placed upon it. I think it would be very challenging for any workplace policy to withstand the kind of scrutiny and test that this policy has been through. And certainly, I think if the work that you would do to set out a set of operating principles, if you like, a set of operating guidance, if you were putting this kind of thing in place, they would go into a lot of detail, particularly about roles and, kind of perceptions.
Reflective of you, I suppose I'm more interested in specifics in and around process and tasks. So if I can put to you that it would also appear that wider, more formal staff engagement appeared limited. We know, there was at least one message to staff emanating from the Permanent Secretary. But in terms of formal two-way engagement with staff, above and beyond engagement with trade unions, where was that meaningful engagement?
Oh, certainly. In terms of all of our policy development, we would have that absolutely at the heart. And I think it's in relation to the standard policies that we would work through that would need to be applied by local managers. You would want to have a very extensive range of engagement based on that.
Was it applied? Because it's not apparent to the information.
In the development of this procedure. No, as I explained, I think in the development of this procedure, because of its unique nature.
Different.
Yeah.
So this one was a bit outside the norm.
Because of the First Minister's role.
And in terms of, you'll have heard this mentioned before as well, that on the 14th of December, the draft policy was sent to one person, someone who at that time was a potential complainer, and that was before it was signed off by the First Minister. And we've heard people make reference to the importance of lived experience, and also others have said, you know, that information was shared, but there was no changes made to the final stages of this policy. Given the absence of wider staff engagement, just as a point of principle, does it not feel strange or unusual sending a draft policy to one individual when there are many ways, surely, in accordance to best practice, that you can tap into a much wider lived experience?
There were a number of reasons why the policy was shared at that point, and I would say it was shared very carefully and with an understanding, having taken advice, that a person in this situation may not be objective, so this wasn't about accepting drafting changes that would shape the application of this policy should they decide to move to a formal complaint. So it was really after consideration that if they were going to proceed, they should understand the policy that was likely to be applied in that case so they could make an informed decision. And it was also set out as part of a range of options to the individual, one of which was always not to make a formal complaint. So that option was always there. I think the tenor of the conversation and part of what we were looking at that point was we needed to learn lessons really quickly, as many organisations were trying to learn lessons very quickly. And a big part of the discussion there was about, would this have made a difference to you? What elements of these kinds of policies would make a difference? So it was very much not would this make a difference to you raising a complaint now, but would this be preventative in the future? Would this help us prevent these kinds of things happening in future?
Okay, but you weren't making it up as you went along, were you?
In what sense?
Well, there's been much emphasis by your own commentary, Ms Richards, and what we've heard from Mr Hind, saying in particular developing a retrospective process that included former ministers, while that, in his view, in the view of others, that was the right thing to do. It was not straightforward. You were working from a blank sheet, lots of references to this being different work or unique work, but nonetheless it doesn't occur in a vacuum. There is a wealth of experience elsewhere, surely ACAS and such like.
And I think whilst it's important to understand that the committee wish to understand the development of the procedure, I think it's very important to recognise that someone can raise a complaint at any point, whether you have a process or not. And if you don't have a process, you would then need to work out what you were going to do about that complaint. So whilst it's helpful and important to try and be transparent and write your policies out, it doesn't actually stop somebody raising a complaint about something. And complaints about third parties, which is essentially, what a minister or a former minister would be in this instance, is a fairly routine part of other policies. It's included within our fairness at work policy. People will have issues with contractors, with people that they come across in other organisations. And what you always have to be clear to people, I think, in those instances, is that there are limits to what you can do. There are limits to the degree to which you can compel someone else to participate in that process because they're not your employee, so you can't enforce their engagement in the development, in the investigation, and there are limitations to the sanctions that you can apply. So there is a fairly well worked out territory here, but yes, it is certainly more complex than it being a civil servant to civil servant policy.
And my very final question, Convener, is yes, complaints need to be investigated, and if there's no process, there needs to be a process and procedure put in place. But therefore, how do you ensure that it's fair and robust to all parties, particularly when it's done at pace? And, you know, what have you learned in terms of the here and now?
I think we're very clear that the procedure is fair and it still stands and it is legal. The work was done very, very carefully to make sure that it fitted in all of those instances. I think you would certainly learn lessons from the whole process in terms of being very clear in terms of the roles that people play and what you're doing at particular points in time. But in terms of having a robust process, I think we can stand by that.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Can I ask quickly, Ms Richards, was anyone else with lived experience asked to comment on the draft policy?
I should be clear, people weren't really asked to comment. They were shared with it for information, but they weren't asked to kind of give drafting comments, if you like. It was
Right,
more
so
sharing
other
up
people
things.
with lived experience were shown copies of the draft policy?
Yes, I think one other person was shown a copy.
Okay. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
You know, I have two sections of questions. Firstly, about the development of the policy and then the application of the policy. I'm happy to break between those and allow others to come in. Good morning, Ms Richards. James Hine confirmed to the committee that there was a background hum of water cooler conversations and rumours about alleged bullying and sexual harassment, misconduct on the part of the former First Minister, Alex Salmond. You joined the organisation in 2010, 4 years before Alex Salmond left office. Can I ask at what point you first heard that informal chatter about concerns about the former First Minister's behaviour?
I'm here to give evidence on behalf of Scottish ministers and not in a personal capacity, so I don't think it's right for me to kind of repeat.
The ministerial code, if I may, the ministerial code, the civil service code allows us to ask you about your recollection of facts and events. We've had Mr Hine confirm that there was a background chatter about concerns about the behaviour of the former First Minister. That's a fact. I'm just asking you when you first learned of that. In my role in HR at that time, between 2010 and 2014, my role was more on the learning and development side, so bullying and harassment was not in my remit. I'm asking about the water cooler conversations that were probably happening in various corners of the building.
I mean, I think in some senses you are slightly aside of that than you are if you're in more kind of ministerially facing roles. I would certainly say at any point in any organisation there's likely to be chatter and noise.
So when did you first hear that chatter about Alex Salmond?
I couldn't give you a specific answer to that.
Was it really recently, or like when all this blew up, or was it near the start of your term in office in the government?
I'm not sure if I can answer it. We can maybe answer it and then confirm whether the legal advisors are content.
But you did know about it.
To say that.
Okay, that's fine.
Richards, if you don't wish to go any further, that's fine.
That's fine. So further to Angela Constance's question about you handing a copy of the draft to one of the people who would later become a complainer, when did you first learn of the allegations of harassment made by that complainer? There was clearly an informal process about this before a formal complaint was lodged. When did she first reveal to you that she had these allegations to make?
I'd need to check the detail. I think that she didn't reveal them to me, and she didn't ever give her account to me directly in that way. She came forward we had put in place a confidential sounding board, and she came forward to that director to share her experience, and that individual then shared a written account with us as HR as part of that process. So, and I think that was the 22nd of November, I think, but I would probably want to just confirm the date. But
there is an email I will refer to in the second half of my questions, which sounds at odds with that suggestion that it was never raised with you directly prior to it becoming made formal. Can I, before we get to that, and I will allow other members in before that, was that draft procedure shared with that particular complainer to give them confidence in the process that would ultimately assess the credibility of that complaint?
it was to ensure they were able to make an informed decision. So you would want them to go into something understanding some of the process that they would be moving into. But as I say, it would have, if they'd have raised the complaint at that point before the process was in place, then we still would have had to have dealt with it.
And was that draft shared with them so that they could help design the procedure to best fit their complaint?
No, not in any direction at all.
That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. I'd just like to understand if the findings of the 2016 People Survey helped identify the gap that policy should be applied to former ministers. Was that something that came up as a result of people's responses to the survey, or was it entirely separate to that process?
No, I wouldn't say it would have come up through that process. It would be entirely separate to that.
Okay, thank you. Following on from colleagues' questions on the nature of the informal rules given to individuals around sexual harassment complaints, I'd just like to understand what was going on in that regard. For example, we've heard that potentially female workers were advised to avoid loan working at certain times and in certain situations. Would that be an example of an informal means of dealing with a harassment complaint?
Are you asking in the sort of broader sense or about that specific?
I'm asking in a broader sense. I'd like to understand what informal mechanisms there were to assist those who had raised informal concerns.
I mean, generally when people raise informal concerns, they do so in the line, so they wouldn't necessarily come to HR. But certainly there are a range of things that you might do and recommend managers to do if issues are raised with them. As ever, it will depend on the seriousness of the matter, and that will have a big bearing as to whether any kind of informal resolution is appropriate. But you would always be guided by the individual raising the issue. The kinds of things that people would do in those circumstances would be forms of mediation, facilitated conversations, might be training. It'd be those kinds of things that people would put in place most generally. I mean, sometimes people would apply to, kind of lone worker type policies, and certainly in relation to our Fairness at Work policy, in relation to engagement with third parties. So if you've got regular contact with an organisation that you're finding problematic in some way, then there's provision for you to not meet them alone and to do those kinds of things. So there's a range of measures that people might put in place in order to ensure that people feel comfortable with their working environment.
There's been much discussion of the sharing of a policy with a particular individual. For absolute clarity, at the point the draft procedure was being shared with that individual, was that individual a complainer?
No.
Okay, thank you. You've spoken of, you've highlighted the fact that few workplace policies have to withstand the scrutiny that this policy has been put through. But we've had much reference to legal advice being taken on the development of the policy throughout the evidence sessions we've taken so far. But it seems that even that level of legal intervention wasn't sufficient to ensure, for example, that the policy was applied robustly enough to avoid the outcome of the judicial review. I note that with regard to the policy, it says the Director of People will designate a senior civil servant as the investigating officer to deal with the complaint. I'd just like to understand why this policy wasn't applied robustly in this case.
Our sense at the time, and certainly my sense at the time, was that it was applied robustly. We thought carefully about the designation of a senior civil servant into the role of the investigating officer, and the kinds of qualities that we had thought about in advance in the more abstract sense of having legal or professional background, HR background. These are the kinds of skills and experience that we were looking to make sure that somebody would be able to apply. The person that I asked to take on the role had many years professional experience, including in very complex and tricky situations. They'd been the head of HR in a mental health charity for 10 years, so they were bringing a wealth of experience that is not common across the wider civil service. So I think our sense was that They were not even in the organisation at the point when the events were alleged to have occurred, so they had no engagement in any way with those events. And as the Cabinet Office wider guidance says, in complex and historical cases, it might be appropriate for cases to be handled within HR. So from my perspective, we were applying the process robustly and clearly in line with the advice and the intention that had been set out.
So in your view, you would do the same thing again?
I think I would be very cautious in terms of clarity of the roles that people were playing at particular points. And it's very clear in retrospect through the judicial review process that the paragraph 10 could be interpreted in a different way, and therefore that even the contact that somebody had in their role as an HR professional could be misconstrued. So I think you would be cautious about that, but certainly at the time that was not a concern that we had.
Okay, thank you. Just finally, there were obviously, is it the case that there were complaints being received at the same time as the policy was being drafted?
We had, in response to the Permanent Secretary's messages, that staff messages that were coming through at that time, I think in that kind of October to December period, we had about 10 people come forward to raise issues. Most of those were about civil servants, so they were issues around harassment, sexual harassment. Some of those were formalised during that time. They would have been dealt with under the Fairness at Work policy and were followed through. Some were dealt with at an informal resolution, and some of them, the individuals decided not to proceed. There weren't any formal complaints received under this procedure before January.
It's obviously really important that there's an appropriate distance between those who are drafting a policy and those who are responsible for implementing that policy. And is it your view that lines were blurred between the two work streams, where we have a policy being drafted, being shared with someone who then goes on to become a complainant? Do you not see that as a blurring of lines that should be avoided?
In terms of drafting a process and applying it, I mean, that would happen very frequently in HR departments, that it will be your HR policy team that will be developing a policy, putting that in place, and then they will be applying it. So I'm not sure that that would be an unusual arrangement.
It just seems, I mean, obviously there are many employees within the civil service, but the draft policy has only been shared specifically with 2 individuals.
Well, it's on our intranet, so it is available more widely.
Okay. I've no further questions at this point.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey.
Can I just follow up that point? I mean, you did only share the draft with 2 people. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, well, in terms of we engage with the unions on it, we were engaging with legal.
Absolutely, but that was after the event. As it was being developed, you shared it with 2 people.
Yes, because
Okay, that's. I just wanted to establish that, because the point about the intranet came much, much later. It came in February, after which time you'd received 2 complaints. Can I say, from an HR perspective, you're making a distinction between concerns and complaints. Is that not a bit of a false distinction, given the seriousness of the allegations?
I mean, it's a distinction in kind of policy terms in that...
But it's not a distinction in the real world, is it?
I mean, I think you're right in that should individuals have decided not to pursue a formal complaint, I think organisationally we still would have had some very significant things to think through. If somebody had said, I don't want to proceed with making a formal complaint, and yet we had a reasonably detailed set of allegations from somebody, then I think organisationally we would have had to have found a way of establishing some closure on that.
So you shared a draft policy on the 14th of December with people who had expressed concerns, not complaints, though I don't recognise the distinction, before the policy was approved. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Why did you do that?
I mean, I think I set that out in the earlier answer, but I'm happy to go through that again.
Just briefly would be useful.
The reasons why we shared that were that we were trying to establish, in terms of our learning as an organisation, whether this would have made a difference to them at the time. Would it have made it more possible to have raised issues about a First Minister, an incumbent First Minister? Would that have made it more straightforward for them if a policy of this nature had been in place? It was done so that if they did decide to proceed to a formal complaint, they had an awareness of the policy that would like to be applied.
But you didn't consult women's groups or anti-bullying groups or anything like that? I think you responded.
We spoke to the Scottish Parliament very closely. We spoke to Police Scotland. They provided a range of advice around charities relating to sexual violence.
Okay, so you didn't actually speak to those groups themselves. Right, can I move us on? Did you tell any potential complainants that Judith McKinnon would be appointed as the investigating officer under a policy which hadn't yet been approved?
I think I told one of the complainers that if they did decide to move to a formal complaint, that it was likely that Judith would take the role of the senior officer.
On what date did you do that?
I don't know. I would need to check the specific date.
Could you? And I'm very conscious that in the civil service everything gets written down, yet I can't seem to find the piece of paper that tells me this. I wonder whether you'd provide the committee with that information too, when you're checking on what date.
Yes, of course. I thought that had been submitted.
Nope. Well, I can't find it.
Okay.
Okay. Can I move on to ask you that the permanent secretary last week seemed to suggest that she wasn't deeply involved in developing the policy process. Did you, as director of people, not keep her updated? You know, what contact did you have with her, or indeed her private secretary? How often was that?
My contact with the permanent secretary is generally quite frequent. At this stage, there was a range of different work going on. There was a lot of staff communications underway. So my role really was to keep her abreast of the full range of activities. She was very concerned that we could be, as she would say, show a clean pair of heels as an organisation in terms of our position on harassment and sexual harassment, that we were really setting out an exemplar position. So across all of those areas, whether it was our internal policies, whether it was communications with staff, whether it was the wider kind of cultural shift, as well as the ministerial policy. So yeah, I would have been in contact with her or her office probably at least on a weekly basis.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question. Mr. Hind earlier, I don't know if you heard his evidence, he was very clear that the policy itself was lawful, but the implementation was not lawful. Given that implementation is an HR function, do you think that's an accurate reflection, or has he indeed just thrown you under the bus?
I think he would have been speaking accurately in relation to the judicial review. We conceded the judicial review on the basis of one aspect of the application. And so in that one aspect of the application, it was deemed to be unlawful by the standard applied by a judicial review.
Thank you, Convener.
Have a short, very particular supplementary from Alistair Allen, and then on to Maureen Wood.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, just picking up on the point made a moment ago by Ms Bailey about the distinction between a concern and a complaint. Would I be right in understanding from what you've just said that the distinction doesn't really have anything to do with the seriousness of the issue, it's more to do with the attitude of the person? Presumably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but presumably not everybody who wishes to make known their concerns about something wishes to pursue a formal complaint. Thank you.
Maureen Wood.
Convener, good afternoon, Ms Richards. You said you joined the civil service in late 2010 in learning and development. What qualifications did you come with?
My background was running a leadership development charity, so I spent 5 years with a leadership development charity. So I came into the learning and development side of the work within People Directorate with that background in leadership, learning and organisational development.
Qualifications in HR?
Not specifically as CIPD, no.
Are you a member of the CIPD?
No, I'm not.
You said it was been said that there was external advice taken. Did any of that come with a cost, and if so, how much?
During the setup of the procedure?
Yeah.
I don't recall. I don't think so. I mean, certainly not in terms of costs. I mean, most of it was in the sense of lessons learned many organisations were in a similar position, needing to look at their own policies, needing to make sure that they were engaging effectively with staff. So I don't think the Scottish Parliament's HR department sent us a bill, so I think they, you know, there was lots of exchange. We've got a wider HR forum of professionals across all of the agencies and NDPBs. We would get together and share material in that way. So, yeah, I don't recall that, but I don't know if on the legal side there may have been some costs.
Strikes me if anybody had been a member of the professional organisation in relation to HR, it might have been quite helpful in this process. However, we'll move on. It's said in our background information that 10% of Scottish Government staff had faced bullying or harassment. That's 10% of how many, roughly? The current survey, I think, covers about 6,500 people. Just as a point of information, I would want to indicate, however, on your previous point, that a number of HR qualified and employment law qualified people were involved in the development of the process. Okay, well, following up on that, the investigating officer, although you said she had some background in dealing with this, that she wasn't an HR professional in the true sense of, well, you know, to me an HR professional is somebody who's gained a qualification, a recognised qualification in it.
Sorry, no, I'm not CIPD qualified, but Judith McKinnon is a fellow of the CIPD.
Okay, that's good to
Sorry,
know.
yeah.
Thank you. It just seems to me that in much of this that we're investigating, the HR department or directorate has kind of been downgraded in a lot of the things, and it could have had a more proactive role. So 10% of 6,500. It's also said that the respondents were able to select multiple categories in relation to the bullying or harassment they encountered. And then it goes on to say the majority of incidents of bullying or harassment came from colleagues, 117, direct managers, 117, or managers in the same part of the organisation, 123. Is the multiple categories those three, or were there further ones that could further drill down into whether they were from heads of service or ministers?
The full list of, when asked who bullied or harassed you, the full list within the UK Civil Service survey covers colleagues in your area, colleagues in a different area, your manager, another senior member of staff, someone I manage, someone working in a different civil service organisation, someone working for a non-civil service organisation, a contractor, a service user, a member of the public, or someone not listed here.
So what category would ministers fall into?
I think someone would probably say another senior member of staff in the Scottish Government, but as I say, these aren't categories that we get to decide on, and in those kinds of settings that would be a relatively small number, so I'm not sure that in any of the UK civil service policies they would set out ministers in such an explicit way.
Was that ever discussed among HR professionals around the country, and whether there should be a specific category for ministers if we're going to be open and transparent?
I'm happy to suggest it. I haven't ever been in one of those conversations.
You haven't been in a conversation about the development of the survey?
In more general terms, but not specifically about adding ministers to that list.
That seems a bit odd. Okay, I'll leave it at that just now.
Okay. Can I just ask Ms Richards, we talked earlier with Mr Hines about the UK Parliament review on such things. Do you know if that was a particular aspect of the discussion about whether ministers should be quite clearly defined in the interests of transparency?
Sorry, you said in the UK Parliament review?
Sorry, there was a review done by the UK government,
UK government,
which was under discussion at the time the Scottish Government was putting their policy together. Do you know if the aspect of a definition of ministers in the interest of transparency was part of that review?
I believe it had a section in the material that they put together, but I may be confusing the Sue Owens review with their kind of more detailed guidance. They have a section about if there are complaints against ministers or special advisors, so they have a section related to that within that material.
Yeah. Yes, I'd be interested to know, following on from the questions that Maureen Watt asked, whether the need for further clarity in that regard would be required, because it does make the figures quite difficult to interpret.
I mean, I would say again, it's important to recognise that the survey is not a mechanism for people to raise individual issues. It's a mechanism by which you get an overall sense of the culture of an organisation. So it is quite wide-ranging in that way. And I would say on the bullying and harassment scores in particular, across the kind of 100+ organisations that are covered, bullying and harassment scores vary from 5% to 20%. I think this year we were at 11%, and of the big organisations of which we compare to, the average is 12%. So whilst it sounds a very disturbing figure, and I think it is a disturbing figure because we wouldn't want anybody to be experiencing bullying and harassment as part of their ongoing work, it is a fairly consistent picture, I think, across most organisations. That
In memory, are bullying and harassment the one heading?
they are, yeah.
They are.
And it's quite wide-ranging. Though, as I say, in 2019 there was a breakdown so that you could get more specific in terms of the nature of the harassment. The biggest category in 2019, I think, is around micromanagement, that being the kind of key issue on which people most kind of regularly said they felt that they had experienced bullying and harassment.
And when the figures are put together, if someone has ticked more than one of the boxes in relation to what they've been suffering, how does that get reflected in the figures in terms of it being the same person who's perhaps ticked 4 boxes?
I'd need to check the exact way in which people are able to do, whether they can. So, no, it does say multiple selections, so yes, they would be able to select more than one category.
Yeah, but how would that then be counted? Would it be 4 instances, or would it just be 1 instance?
I would assume it's counted as 4 instances.
Right, so the figures may not reflect the number of people.
Yeah, though you do also get the numbers of people, so you can probably do a comparison.
Okay,
across the two.
thank you for that clarification. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. We heard from Mr Hind about the iterative process that was involved in producing the policy. Can you say a bit more about your role in determining the content of the various stages of that iterative process?
As James set out, he leaded off on the drafting. There was lots of engagement across legal and members of my team in terms of setting out, I think in particular, how do you bring together the ministerial code responsibilities with those of the employer, and particularly the duty of care to staff. So that was really, I suppose, the key part that I was playing in that was making sure that we were linking across to the duty of care to staff, our responsibilities as an employer within the policy.
And on that duty of care, I'm going to be careful how I ask this, because I'm not asking about individuals here, but you said that you sort out, we've heard that rather, people with, in inverted commas, lived experience were sought out or were contacted in any case. I take it some kind of support was offered to these individuals as well.
I mean, the individuals had already come forward to the confidential sounding board, so, support had already been offered through that kind of route. So the sharing of the procedure was really just part of a wider discussion with them in terms of the options open to them and their wishes.
And can you tell us from your own point of view, but from your own role, where you came in to decisions that were made about including former ministers in the policy?
Or this was already included.
Okay. And would you concur with what we've heard from Mr Hind, which is that about the fairly limited role of SPADs. But again, were you in touch with SPADs throughout this process? No.
No engagement at all.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Okay, I have Murdo Fraser, and then I'll go back to Alex Cole-Hamilton, who kindly kept reserved some of his questions. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Convener. I only have really one question as a follow-up to Alistair Allen's question about the involvement of special advisors. And we heard from Mr Hind earlier that, in his view, it would be unusual to have a special advisor involved in the preparation of a policy based on HR. Would that be, from your experience, that would be a reasonable position?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I was distracted. How dare I? Please, Mr Fraser. You're done?
I'm done.
That's so unlike you. My goodness. Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Richards, before I get on to my questions about the application of this procedure, can I just say, I know this is very stressful for you. I accept that, and I appreciate you coming today. And this must jar against everything you've always been taught about protecting both the civil service and the government. But it's really important that we get to the nub of the truth in all of this. And the Civil Service Code does not preclude you from doing it. And I have to say, from some of the answers that you've given and some of the answers that James Hind has given, that we as a committee do seem to be encountering what I would describe as a grey wall of silence on some of this. So I'd ask just in these final questions if you could be as straight as possible. Because when Alison Johnson asked whether complainers had come forward during the development of the process, you said they had not. But obviously they were not complainers at the time because there was no procedure for them to complain by. But we know that there were 3 of them from an email you wrote on the 12th of December. And for the record, that's document YY0046. In that, you wrote an email to Miss A asking if, after your discussion with her, that she'd come to a decision on whether to raise a formal complaint. In the email, you keep using the term we, by which you mean yourself and Judith McKinnon, who was copied into the same email. You suggest Miss A wait until after the new year if she wanted to proceed. Did you suggest this so that you could be sure that the new policy on handling complaints against former ministers had been signed off and was then live?
I think I was going on holiday the next day.
Okay.
I think that even civil servants were allowed holidays. I would just like to clarify a couple of points. I said that it was shared that they weren't a complainer at that point. They had raised a concern, but they hadn't formally raised a complaint. She could at any point have decided to say this is the formal complaint. We may or may not have had the procedure in place at that time, but we still would have had to have dealt with it. So it's an issue, but it's not really the deciding issue.
Thank you. In the same email, you say we, and by that you mean you and Ms McKinnon, have now spoken to 2 other people considering their position. Can I ask first, had either of those other 2 complainers or potential complainers been given a draft of the procedure?
I don't recall specifically, but my recollection is that we had a hard copy with us when we spoke to one of the others. They did not come forward with a complaint.
Okay. You chose at this point in the email to reveal the existence of other complainers to Miss A. Was it your intention to share this knowledge with Miss A so that she might go and seek out those other potential complainants?
No, it wasn't. We'd taken advice from Police Scotland in terms of how to take a victim-led approach, and part of that indicated that you could say that if there were other people who were considering complaints, it might be of help to them. I would say, actually, I probably can't say because I think it will get us into territory in terms of the complainers. But yeah, I probably I can't.
Can I stop you there, because these documents have not been published by the Parliament?
So well, in which case, Convener, I'm not entirely sure on what basis we're meant to use these documents if we're not allowed to use them to cross-examine witnesses.
Well, they're for your own information, and I would draw your attention to the court restrictions that are there and to the issue of potential jigsaw identification. And the committee did take the decision that we wouldn't directly refer to anything that hadn't been published by the Parliament. So if you want to carry on, please do so in very general terms, but please don't be specific, because I understand Ms Richards' concerns.
Okay, no, I accept that we agreed that we wouldn't discuss things that have not been published. I accept that, but nevertheless, I think that this is a very, very important point and a very important exchange. So forgive me if I've overstepped the mark. I won't refer to the email again, but my final question or questions is specifically about paragraph 10 of the procedure. It lays out that a designated senior civil servant will be designated as investigating officer, and that person won't have any prior involvement or knowledge of the matter being raised. Given that Judith McKinnon had already had discussions with complainers, did you at any point consider her appointment in that role as problematic, given the gravity of these allegations under the terms of paragraph 10?
I didn't, and I think it certainly was the gravity of these issues and the sensitivity of them which made it so important that we were able to handle it very confidentially within HR, and to do so very, very carefully with people who were very highly skilled. The engagement that Judith had with the individuals in advance was absolutely in her role as an HR professional. It was about setting out options. In earlier drafts of the procedure, we actually had more detail about what that senior officer role might include, and that included setting out their options. It included providing access to sources of support. So in my mind, it was completely consistent with that.
Do you consult any other senior civil servant or senior member of the SNP or special advisor on the appointment of Judith McKinnon as the investigating officer for these complaints?
I spoke to my line manager and, kind of the other people engaged at that time, but no one on the political side at all.
Thank you. No further questions.
Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Convener. I wonder, Ms Richards, if I could direct you to document YY062, the emails on the 10th of November 2017. And these appeared to appoint 2 senior officials to the informal role of pastoral support and confident. And there was also an email to staff to offer senior government official contact informally to talk over any issues. Was this put in place as a result of the gap analysis which HR carried out, establishing that there was a reluctance for people to come forward? And if so, how many people roughly did come forward? And of those people, did they, any of them, end up to be formal complainers at the end of the day? And there's one other aspect. I know I've asked 3 questions, but hopefully this one you will also answer. If this was good practice and a good way of giving these people the support to come forward, why wasn't it included in the formal development of policy? Because without that, it looks as though this was set up for a niche reason, which was nothing to do with putting in the very best policy to encourage these individuals who've been treated so badly to come forward.
I think on the pastoral support, the confidential sounding board, as it became known, I think there were a lot of organisations at that point were trying to understand what creates the reluctance in people coming forward, particularly around sexual harassment, but more generally. And I think that the Scottish Parliament was putting in place a helpline. It was doing an independent helpline in that way. So I think a lot of organisations at that time were thinking about how do you bridge the gap. And certainly for us, putting in a senior person who could be contacted in that kind of way, it felt like it was an opportunity, I think, to really just to be sure that we didn't have a big issue that we weren't aware of, that there wasn't something lurking that we didn't fully understand. And I think it's a valuable process. We do already have within Scottish Government, and have had for some time, an employee assistance programme, and that's a 24/7 line, so people can phone that to seek advice and support on any issue. But that is completely separate. So if they raise things in that setting, it wouldn't be a mechanism, there wouldn't be a route back to the organisation knowing about it unless the individual decided to take that step. So the confidential sounding board, I suppose, is in a slightly kind of grayer area in that they're not entirely independent and outside, and in that case unconnected back into the core organisation.
Is that the reason? Is that the case?
No, I mean, I think there's opportunities for us to continue there. I think it very quickly...
But at present, if someone came forward, they do not have that opportunity to speak to this informal parent, to have that person, to be encouraged, you know, to have the confidence to go forward. That doesn't exist.
I would need to check, but I think it may well still be on our intranet. So
Permanent Secretary suggested it was a one-off just for on the back of the Me Too. And that seems incredible. It then begins to look like a niche arrangement for a specific purpose.
I mean, certainly at was described as the watershed moment. I think certainly there were provisions put in place at that time. I think the individual had, I don't know if they all came directly to her, some of them came to HR, but there were about 10 people that came forward during that time. Some of those did proceed to formal complaints, some of them were resolved through other means. But I think that it came to a point where actually no one was contacting her anymore, so it didn't, you know, it just sort of fell away more naturally, I think, in that people weren't coming forward directly in that way. But I think, you know, yes, I mean, certainly we would want to...
I think it's a moving feast with people. It's not a moment of time people aren't coming forward, so I don't find that an answer very persuasive.
Well, no, I think we'd be very keen and happy to continue to have that kind of arrangement in place.
Thank you.
I don't see indications from any other members. So can I ask a final question? I'm still really interested in this issue about a draft policy being shared with potential complainers. And I'm interested to know why it wasn't shared with any other members of staff who perhaps had raised concerns about bullying, harassment, who had been through the process before, just to see whether they felt that this was an improvement on the situation that they went through, perhaps, or you know, if they felt that actually this wouldn't have been much better. So their experiences could have fed into the development of policy. And I'm interested as to why that sharing of policy wasn't widened in any way.
I mean, I think for a specific policy about complaints about ministers, we had very, very few, in fact, no formal complaints about ministers until these had been raised. So all we had at that point was one issue that had been raised and dealt with under the informal policy, but that wouldn't have been covered by this policy anyway because it wasn't a sexual harassment incident. So it wasn't, you know, we didn't have a wide staff group with relevant experience on whom we could draw.
So it was really just about ministers?
Well, the policy is just about ministers.
Yes, so you weren't interested in gathering wider information about the organisation in general as part of all of this?
Oh, well, that was all underway at the same time, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of work going on about our internal policies. There was a lot of work going on about civil servant to civil servant behaviours. We refreshed our standards of behaviour. We created a new route map so that individuals in the organisation could understand all of the routes by which harassment and considerations could be raised. So, yeah, there was a wide range of work going on with the wider staff group, but that was more general and it wasn't specific to ministers.
So you had a staff group particularly that you would consult with on wider issues of such policy?
We tend to do all of that directly with our trade unions because they have that role as representing staff. So we would do that more specifically with the trade unions, but also more generally we have things like a people panel. So you'll have issues where you might test topics with the people panel and through the wider people survey. So, and also our staff network, so our equality groups. Typically we would include them in the development of new policies as well. But I think it was a specific policy that the First Minister needed to sign off, and in that instance slightly different to normal HR policies where we would go through that range of activity.
So you very much dealt with it in isolation then?
I mean, we were seeing it as part of an overall, package of work that was underway, but it was specific in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think that there's anything else. And again, yes, Alec Coleman.
Following your questioning there, just one point of clarification, and it's the second person who was shared a draft of the procedure, did they then go on to form a formal complaint, or were they a potential complainer who then decided not to take it forward?
They didn't proceed to a formal complaint.
That's fine.
Okay. Can I thank Ms Richards? And no doubt, looking through the official report, there are some issues which we will expect a submission in writing upon. Thank you very, very much for your attendance. And that concludes the public evidence sessions for today, and we'll now move into private sessions.